The humid, heavy air of the Ashow Valley pressed on their lungs like a blanket soaked in sweat and fear. 07:43. Staff Sergeant Bradley Razor O'Connell, 32, advanced cautiously, hugging the bamboo stalks. His machete, flashing in the diffused light, slid across the smooth surface as if alive. Ancient Celtic words, whispered, seemed the only thread connecting him to home, to himself. The deep, jagged scar across his left eyebrow ached from the moisture, but he paid it no mind. Ahead, 50 meters away, the observation post was supposed to be a 6-man team. Mission, routine reconnaissance. But the jungle lived its own life, and today it was clearly not in the mood for peace. Suddenly, a crack like a breaking bone tore through the silence, followed by a machine gun burst. O'Connell dropped instantly, pressing himself to the ground. The earth shuddered from explosions. Chaos. Shouts. The sound of tearing fabric and dull thuds of bodies falling onto wet foliage. Comms went dead. The silence that followed the shooting was worse than the din itself. It was heavy, filled with horror and a premonition of disaster. "Damn it!" O'Connell cursed, rising to a knee. In front of him, a few meters away, stood Private First Class Emiliano Coyote Saavedra, 21, medic. He lay on his side, clutching his stomach. Dark, red liquid seeped from beneath his fingers, instantly staining the green foliage a sinister color. His face contorted in a grimace of pain, but his eyes, wide with terror, fixed on the sergeant. "Sarge!" he choked out, his voice trembling with childlike fear. O'Connell rushed to him. Bullets whizzed somewhere overhead, but he didn't notice them. His world narrowed to this clearing, to this bleeding young man. He felt adrenaline surge, pushing out the last vestiges of fear, leaving only cold resolve. His gaze fell on a tattered photograph that had fallen from Saavedra's pocket, a little girl with a bright smile, his sister. "Hold on, Coyote! Hold on, damn it!" O'Connell yelled, sinking down beside him. His hands, accustomed to weapons, now desperately tried to staunch the bleeding. He saw Saavedra's breathing become ragged, his face grow pale. "I'm not letting you go, you hear me," he shouted, trying to push through the ringing in his ears, the roar of his own thoughts. "Don't let go." The phrase, torn from the depths of his soul, seemed the only anchor in this sea of madness. He felt the warmth of life draining from the medic's hands, and something inside him began to break. But he couldn't let it happen. Not now. The sun barely pierced the dense canopy, painting bizarre patterns on the ground that did nothing to dispel the sense of encroaching darkness. The air smelled of earth, decaying leaves, and something metallic, blood. O'Connell felt a sharp pain in his shoulder, but ignored it. He knew this was just the beginning. Loss. And ahead lay a long, deadly road, the jungle. 15. Sergeant O'Connell, 32, sat on the wet stone floor, the smell of mold and rotting wood. Somewhere ahead, a rustling sound. What would he do next? The forest's breath no longer felt menacing but suffocating. The ruins of a French plantation, once perhaps a refuge, had now become a tomb. 5 men, that's all that remained of his squad. 5 lonely souls, lost in a green hell. O'Connell sat, leaning against a scuffed column, feeling the cold, damp stones seep through the thin fabric of his uniform. His left eyebrow throbbed. The scar seemed to pulse in time with his racing heart. Nearby, under a makeshift shelter of torn leaves, Emiliano Coyote Saavedra breathed heavily. Blood-soaked bandages wrapped his abdomen, but the wound was too deep. O'Connell saw it in his pale face and uneven breathing. "Water," Saavedra croaked, his voice barely audible. O'Connell nodded, though he knew water was scarce. They were deep in enemy territory, with no comms, no support. The only thing he could offer now was his presence. He glanced at the others. Sergeant Joe, Scar Harrison, his M60 machine gun lay beside him, secure like an extension of his hand. His powerful frame seemed invulnerable, but even in his eyes, tension was evident. Specialist 5th Class Li Wei Chen, an American of Chinese descent, sat with his knees hugged to his chest, his usually calm face pale. Beside him, as if part of these ruins, sat Latan, the local guide. His dark eyes, usually full of perceptiveness, seemed to see something others couldn't. O'Connell felt those eyes studying him, assessing him, and it annoyed him. "Sergeant," Chen called, his voice quiet. "I think we need to figure out how to make a fire. The night promises to be cold." O'Connell stood up, stretching his stiff muscles. Fire. That meant smoke, and smoke was a signal. But the cold could kill too. He walked over to what had once been a hearth and began examining the damp logs. Every rustle in the undergrowth made his heart stop. The Viet Cong were surely combing the area. He recalled his previous assignments, moments when it seemed all was lost. Bangladesh, that incident with the knife. He remembered feeling his life hanging by a thread, but he had been pulled out. Here, there was no one to pull him out, only these four. "Harrison, check your ammo," O'Connell ordered, his voice steady despite the inner turmoil. "Chen, try to find something dry for kindling. Latan, you know these parts. Is there a water source nearby?" The guide slowly turned his head, his gaze settling on O'Connell. "The river, about 2 kilometers northeast. But it could be dangerous." "Everything here is dangerous, kid," Harrison grumbled, sorting through ammo belts. "The main thing is we have enough ammo to get out." O'Connell winced. He knew Harrison was right. Every shot counted. He walked over to Saavedra. The medic looked at him, his eyes slightly glazed. A tattered photograph peeked from his chest pocket. A little girl. "Don't worry, Coyote," O'Connell said, his voice softening. "We'll get out. Just hang on." He felt the damp fabric of his uniform cling to his wounded shoulder. The pain was dull but persistent. He remembered cleaning his machete before going out. That ritual, muttering old Celtic words. At that moment, he felt confident. Now that confidence had evaporated, leaving only the weight of responsibility. Chen returned with a handful of dry leaves and rotten slivers. The fire wouldn't catch. The snapping of branches in the distance made everyone tense. Lathan put a finger to his lips. His eyes widened. O'Connell felt a chill creep into his bones, despite the humid, suffocating air. He drew his machete, feeling its familiar weight in his hand. Light, but deadly. He looked at his men. Fear was etched on their faces, but also hope. Hope that now depended entirely on him. He had to find a way out. He had to get them out of here. The green twilight beneath the canopy of giant ferns, only sparse, scattered sunbeams penetrated the dense curtain of leaves, tinting the damp air with swampy hues. The scent of decaying leaves, damp earth, and something elusively sharp, like ammonia, tickled their nostrils. Beside O'Connell, leaning his back against the trunk of an ancient tree, sat Li Chen, his fingers nervously fiddling with the wires of a radio. Harrison, with his usual grim concentration, checked the belt of his M60, slowly, as if measuring every millimeter. Emiliano Saavedra, pale but less dazed now, clutched a tattered photograph in his hand, while Latan, as always, remained impassive, his gaze wandering over the thicket, as if searching for invisible threats. "Quiet," Latan whispered, his voice barely breaking the heavy silence. A dull sound, soldiers. O'Connell tensed instantly. His gaze darted to the side where a barely perceptible rustle had come from. Less than a minute later, they heard it more clearly, muffled voices. The steady, relentless tramp of many feet. Viet Cong. They were much closer than anticipated. "Map? Has anyone seen the map?" Chen croaked, frantically looking around. "Forget the map," Harrison snapped, his fingers resting on the trigger. "We're on their territory, and they smell us." Silhouettes appeared from behind the dense thicket. 6 men, dressed in dark camouflage uniforms, with SKS rifles at the ready. They moved with organization, like a single organism, combing the area. The patrol leader, a young man with a square jaw, stopped, listening. He seemed to have caught movement. "Down!" O'Connell roared, his voice cutting through the growing noise. "Chen, try to find cover." They dropped to the ground, blending into the thick vegetation. The smell of damp earth rose with renewed force. O'Connell's gaze slid to Harrison's hand, resting on the M60. The machine gunner was ready, but one M60 against 6 rifles was suicide if they couldn't use the element of surprise. "They're coming this way," Lathan whispered, his eyes fixed on the approaching patrol. 30 meters. O'Connell felt a thick, viscous wave of fear rise to his throat. He remembered once, during training, an instructor told him, "Fear is just a signal, Bradley, a signal that you're alive." Now that signal was deafening within him. "Harrison," O'Connell whispered, his voice on the verge of hoarseness. "When I give the command, go. Short bursts only. Conserve ammo." The patrol drew closer. Now their faces, their tense, wary expressions could be distinguished. One of the soldiers walking ahead pushed aside the branches and froze, his gaze fixed directly where the survivors lay. His hands slowly rose, pointing. "Now!" O'Connell shouted. The next moment, the jungle erupted in fire. The M60 machine gun roared. spitting out a death-dealing stream of red-hot shell casings. Harrison worked with virtuosity, his body seeming to merge with the machine. Short, sharp bursts tore through the air, forcing the enemy patrol to press themselves to the ground. One of them fell, unnaturally contorted. Another, trying to get up, stumbled and collapsed, his rifle falling from his weakened fingers. More, more! O'Connell yelled, firing his M16, trying to cover the machine gunner. But they were too few. The ammo in Harrison's belt ran out with alarming speed. He saw an enemy machine gunner, hidden behind a tree trunk, prepare to open return fire. "Harrison, back!" O'Connell screamed. The machine gun fell silent. Harrison, breathing heavily, pulled the reload lever, but despair flickered in his eyes. The belt was empty. Only a few rounds remained in the magazine. "They still have strength," Chen shouted, pointing at the two remaining enemies who, despite the losses, had begun to flank them. O'Connell realized they couldn't hold this position. Having lost so many precious rounds, they were even more vulnerable. Lathan, seizing the enemy's confusion, grabbed O'Connell's arm. "This way," he whispered, pointing to a narrow gorge, barely visible amidst the dense greenery. They bolted forward, and behind them, as if pursued by ghosts, enemies rapidly approached. Harrison, his M60 empty on his shoulder, covered their retreat, firing his pistol. The sound of his shots was desperate but brief. Each shot seemed to cost him his life. "Don't stop," O'Connell shouted, feeling his lungs burn from the exertion. "Run." They slipped into the gorge, which instantly swallowed them, hiding them from their pursuers' eyes. From behind, for a moment, came the sound of shots, then a dull thud. Harrison. O'Connell turned sharply, but his gaze met an impenetrable wall of foliage. His heart clenched. The enemies, hearing the shots, rushed into the gorge, but now nature itself was their barrier. Saavedra began, his voice trembling. He knew what he was doing. O'Connell cut him off, his voice icy. "The main thing now is to get out of here. If we fall into their hands." He didn't finish. The air in the gorge became even heavier, filled with the smell of fear and unknown danger. The path to their own lines became more ethereal, and the enemy seemed to know their every step. The jungle's breath thickened, humid vapor enveloping faces like a shroud. Sergeant O'Connell, 32, felt sticky mud clogging the folds of his uniform, and a wound pulsed on his right temple. He looked at Li Chen, 26, who, like a surgeon, tinkered with scraps of wire and an old radio. Around them, silence, viscous as swamp mire, broken only by the chirping of unknown insects and their own rapid heartbeats. Somewhere out there, in this impenetrable green, the enemy lurked, and every rustle seemed like footsteps of death. "A few more seconds, Sergeant," Chen whispered, his fingers flashing over the toggles. O'Connell nodded, gripping his machete. He could already hear the old Celtic words, whispered before every sortie, stuck in his throat. In the last fight, Harrison 30, machine gunner, Scar, from Detroit, proved to be a real beast, but it cost them almost all their ammo. Now they were bare, defenseless, cornered. "Trying to pick up anything," Chen muttered. His face, illuminated by the dim light of a small flashlight, showed extreme tension. The jungle seemed to resist, jamming signals, turning the airwaves into cacophony. O'Connell felt his body, exhausted by endless marches and battles, begin to protest. Every muscle ached, every breath was a struggle. But the fear of losing his men, that invisible enemy that sat in his stomach, drove him forward. "Enemy, they know we're here," Saavedra, 21, the medic, a native of San Antonio, croaked. He clutched the tattered photograph of his younger sister. Heard voices? Very close. "Quiet," O'Connell hissed. He listened. Indeed, somewhere in the distance, muffled by the noise of the forest, a muted conversation could be heard. It sounded like Vietnamese, but he couldn't make out the words. It didn't seem like a simple patrol. There was something planned about it. "Got it!" Chen exclaimed, and a crackle, then a snippet of voice came from the radio speaker. It was like someone speaking in French, then switching to Vietnamese. O'Connell strained his ears. In the fragments of phrases, words like river, crossing, capture flashed. Did they know where the group was trying to get to? "What are they saying, Chen?" O'Connell asked, his voice taut. "It seems they're waiting for someone or something, discussing some plan. I managed to catch only a couple of phrases, but it's very bad, Sergeant. They know we're somewhere here, and they seem to be preparing to intercept us." Chen wiped the sweat from his forehead. They plan to outflank us towards the river. Their main objective is to stop us from passing. O'Connell looked at the map, or rather, what was left of it, a scrap of paper, crisscrossed with pencil lines. The river was their only chance. If the enemy blocked it, they would be trapped. "Harrison, how's your machine gun?" he asked, though he knew the answer. "Empty, Sergeant." "My head feels like it did after yesterday," Harrison grumbled, but his eyes held no hint of humor. He took a can of preserved peaches from the provisions box. Something he'd guarded like the apple of his eye. He looked at it, then put it back. No time for sweets. "Lieutenant, are you with us?" O'Connell turned to their local guide. His eyes seemed to see everything the jungle concealed. "Always," Lieutenant replied curtly, his gaze calm but sharp. He saw the danger, felt it, but didn't panic. "We'll have to move, fast, through the field." O'Connell paused, his gaze sweeping over the somber trees. "Chen, you'll be at the rear. If you hear anything, let me know immediately. Harrison, you're up front with the rifle. Saavedra, you're with Lathan. Be ready for anything. I'll be with you." The decision was made. Risky, but there was no other choice. Their chances of survival, with the enemy knowing their intentions, were dwindling by the minute. O'Connell felt the weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders. This was more than just orders. It was the lives of his men, and he was ready to stake everything to preserve them. Suddenly, Lathan stopped, raising a hand. "Quiet," he whispered. Everyone froze. From the depths of the forest came a sound like a dry twig snapping, then another, then muffled footsteps. They were coming, and they were coming straight for them. "Time is limited, Sergeant," Chen said, his voice tense. "They're close. We need to choose a direction, now." O'Connell looked at the map, then at the faces of his men. Each one was a part of him, his burden and his hope. He felt the adrenaline begin to surge through his blood, pushing back fatigue. "The field," he said, looking straight ahead to where he calculated the minefield to be. "We have no other way." "Sergeant," Saavedra exclaimed, "that's suicide. It's our only chance." O'Connell cut him off. "We're going through it. Lathan, you'll guide us." The guide nodded, his eyes meeting O'Connell's for a moment. In them, O'Connell saw not just readiness, but something more, understanding. An understanding that on this land, in this war, death was just part of the journey. "Prepare yourselves," O'Connell commanded. "We move one by one. Chen, maintain contact. If anything goes wrong..." He didn't finish. Ahead, among the trees, a shadow flickered. Not just a shadow, it was a man, then another, and another. The enemy was already here. "They found us," Harrison whispered, his hand instinctively going to his pistol grip. "Then the game is on," O'Connell replied, drawing his machete. The sharp blade glinted in the twilight, reflecting the dim light. The Celtic words he muttered before every sortie now echoed in his mind, like an ancient charm. He felt a cold sweat trickle down his back. Before him lay the unknown, an enemy ready to kill, and a group of men whose lives depended on him. The dampness, thick as cotton, saturated the air. 37 degrees Celsius, 92% humidity. Every breath scorched his lungs. Bradley O'Connell, his soaked uniform clinging to his body, led the group through a green hell. The smell of rotting leaves and damp earth made him nauseous. The scar on his brow throbbed, reflecting his nervous tension. "Stay close, don't fall behind," he rasped, his voice barely cutting through the jungle's din. Their objective, the river. Water. Hope. They had been walking for 3 hours when Lathan, their guide, stopped dead. His usually calm eyes were wide, ancient fear frozen in them. He raised his hand, pointing to the ground beneath their feet. "Minefield," he whispered, his voice trembling. The French left them, many. O'Connell felt his fingers grow cold. He had seen maps, knew about such areas, but seeing them with his own eyes was entirely different. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of deadly traps, hidden beneath a thin layer of fallen leaves. To pass through such a place was a task for God, not men. How do we get through?" he asked, addressing himself more than the guide. Lathan straightened, his face taking on a focused expression. He began to carefully examine the ground, his fingers gently touching the grass, the bark of trees. He moved with astonishing grace, as if dancing with death itself. "I know," he said, pointing to barely visible tracks on the ground, to slightly flattened stems. "Slowly, very slowly, and I will lead." O'Connell nodded, but disbelief warred within him. This youth seemed to see what was hidden from the others. But the jungle was not his native village. Here, the enemy could be anywhere, and this land was soaked in blood. Harrison, Chen, you follow me. Saavedra, stay behind. No sudden movements, he ordered. The first few meters were the hardest. O'Connell followed Lethan, feeling the pulse of the earth under his soles. Each step felt like an eternity. He heard his own heart pounding, the whistling in his ears. The air became even thicker, filled with the smell of metal and gunpowder, which seemed to seep from the soil itself. He saw Chen, the radio specialist, tightly grip his backpack, his face pale. Saavedra, the medic, tried to breathe evenly, but his eyes darted around. Suddenly, Latan froze. He pointed to a small, barely visible spot of earth that looked different from everything around it. Here, he whispered. Do not touch. Go around. O'Connell saw what he meant. A small, almost invisible metal loop sticking out of the ground. A tripwire. Damn, he exhaled. The guide continued to lead them, his movements becoming more confident. He pointed out what was invisible to the others. Barely perceptible tracks, the placement of stones, the direction of the wind. He knew this land, knew its secrets. But still, every time he stopped to indicate another danger, tension grew within the group. Harrison, the formidable machine gunner, clenched the grip of his M60, his gaze hardening. This guy really knows what he's doing, Sergeant, he grumbled. He's leading us, Joe. That's all we need to know right now, O'Connell replied, trying to sound calm. But even he felt the growing distrust. So much depended on this young guide. He had seen too much death. They walked about another kilometer when Latan stopped. Before them lay a field littered with shell craters. It looked like a battlefield that had endured hell. The river, the guide said, pointing into the distance. There, very close. But another obstacle lay between them and the river. They saw shadows flickering among the trees on the other side of the field. A patrol, or something more. Looks like we're not the only ones heading for the river, Chen said, his voice quiet. O'Connell looked at the river, then at the shadows. They were far away, but they were there. We need to move. Fast, he said. Latan, are you sure this path is safe? The guide nodded, but a shadow of doubt flickered in his eyes. Careful, Sergeant, he said. This land remembers much, and not all of its memories are kind. The humid, dense air enveloped their lungs like a wet rag. This time, even Latan couldn't point to a safe path. The field, strewn with deadly gifts from the past, stretched before them, and ahead, beyond the trees, shadows flickered. Every step through the tall, yellowing grass was accompanied by a nervous crackle and rustle that seemed too loud in the tense silence. The sun, breaking through the dense foliage, painted deceptive patterns of light and shadow on the ground, turning every root, every stone into a potential trap. Water, Harrison croaked, his voice dry as cracked earth. His lips were chapped, his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. Empty canteens hung from their belts, reminders of the growing panic. O'Connell felt a spasm grip his throat. He checked his canteen, barely 3 sips. Latan, is there a source nearby? He asked, looking at the guide. The man shook his head, his gaze fixed on the distance towards where the enemy should be. Far, over the hill, but he faltered. But what? O'Connell insisted. There's a village, Latan whispered, and people there, not ours. O'Connell's heart sank. A hidden Viet Cong settlement. Great news. We need water, Latan. We won't last a day without it. I know, Sergeant, but it's dangerous. There could be up to 30 men there. 30 against 5 of us, Harrison grumbled, his hand nervously clenching his M60. Sounds like a party. We don't need a fight, Joe, O'Connell said. We need water, quietly and quickly. He looked at his men. Saavedra was trying to calm Chen, who was trembling, clutching his radio to his chest as if it were an amulet. We'll go where you think, Latan. There are the fewest people? O'Connell asked. The guide nodded, pointing towards dense bamboo thickets. There might be a stream, but they might be there too. O'Connell finished. Harrison, you're with me. Chen, you stay with Lethan and Saavedra. Keep your weapons ready. If anything goes wrong, retreat to the river. Understood? Chen nodded, his eyes full of fear. I understand, Sergeant. O'Connell and Harrison moved forward, pushing through thorny bushes. Every sound, a branch snapping, leaves rustling, made them freeze. They moved slowly, trying to be silent, their eyes scanning the thickets, searching for the slightest sign of enemy presence. The air grew even thicker, saturated with the smell of damp earth, rotting leaves, and something else, smoke. As they approached the presumed stream, they heard muffled voices, women's and children's. These weren't soldiers, but they were there. A settlement. O'Connell gestured for Harrison to stop. They lay down in the thicket, observing. A few huts made of palm leaves, women carrying water from the stream, children playing nearby, and two men with rifles, lazily overseeing the order. 2 guards, Sergeant, Harrison whispered. And women and children. If we start shooting, we won't shoot, O'Connell replied. We need water, and to leave unnoticed. He thought. There was only one way. He pointed to a spot between the huts where there seemed to be no one. When I give the signal, you distract them, loudly. I'll come from the other side, get the water, and leave. The main thing is no noise. Are you crazy, Bradley? Harrison whispered. Maybe, but we're dying of thirst. O'Connell waited for the moment when the male guards were distracted by something at the far end of the settlement. He signaled Harrison. The latter, with a grunt, stood up and, holding his M60 at the ready, roared loudly, Hey, is anyone there? The men turned. At the same moment, O'Connell, moving like a shadow, slipped to the stream. He quickly filled his canteen, then Harrison's. One of the guards, noticing movement, raised his rifle, but Harrison had already opened fire. A series of short, deadly bursts made the men scatter. Panic erupted. Let's go, O'Connell shouted, throwing the canteens to Harrison. They dashed back towards the bamboo thickets where the others were waiting. The sounds of gunfire and shouts were now clearer. I told you, Sergeant, it was going to be a party, Harrison croaked, gasping for breath. Returning to the group, they quickly distributed the water. Sip by sip, they felt life returning to their bodies, but the peaceful settlement was now, most likely, fully aware of their presence. The sounds of battle erupting behind them were proof of that. They heard us, Chen said, his voice trembling. It was inevitable, O'Connell replied, standing up. Now we need to get to the river, and fast. He looked at his men. Fear was in their eyes, but also determination. They were close to their goal, but danger seemed to be dogging their heels, giving them no chance for a breather. The humid, suffocating air of the river enveloped them, thick as palm milk. Just 50 meters to the saving water, to a chance to hear familiar voices over the radio, to the possibility of escaping this green hell. O'Connell walked ahead, his eyes, accustomed to the jungle's twilight, scanning every opening, every bend of the thorny bank. Behind him, like ghosts, glided the others. Saavedra, with his hand on his bandage, Chen, clutching his radio as if it were a precious jewel, Harrison, walking silently despite the weight of his baby, and Lathan, whose gaze seemed to penetrate the dense curtain of leaves, catching invisible dangers. Quiet, Lathan whispered, stopping. There, his words died in his throat. Ahead, where the river made a gentle bend, between the gnarled trunks of mangrove trees, silhouettes were visible. 3, 4, no, probably more. They sat, relaxed, like idle hunters awaiting their prey. An ambush. Sudden, inevitable, like a viper's strike. Viet Cong, Harrison stated, his fingers already on the M60's grip. Don't shoot, O'Connell ordered, his voice quiet but steely. We can't let them know we're here. If they raise the alarm, we're finished. He looked at his men. They were exhausted, at their limit. Another skirmish could be their last, but a fire burned in his eyes that even now, after all the losses, had not been extinguished. We need a path, right along the bank. Quietly. They moved, pressing themselves to the ground, measuring each step with incredible caution. The river whispered nearby, its water, so coveted, now seemed like a mockery. They were so close, but the chasm between them and salvation was filled with the enemy. The world around them narrowed to a few meters of green, to the sound of their own breathing and the rustle of leaves. Sergeant, Chen whispered, pointing forward. They're setting mines along the bank, O'Connell saw. A few dozen meters before the ambush, in the ground, almost hidden by grass, were visible the characteristic metal casings. A minefield. As if by design, the road to the river was blocked. Latan, O'Connell addressed the guide. You know how they set them? Is there a safe path? Latan nodded, his eyes tense, as if he saw not only the mines, but also the thoughts of those who laid them. There is a narrow trail between the trees, very carefully. Good, O'Connell said. Harrison, Chen, you follow him. Saavedra, you're behind me. We'll cover. If anything happens. He didn't finish. Everyone knew what could happen. The group began to move along the barely visible trail. Latan stepped as if dancing, each movement measured to the millimeter. One wrong step, one careless thought, and an explosion would tear them to pieces. Harrison, usually boisterous, was now invisible, his body seeming to become part of the jungle. Chen, despite his fear, moved forward, his fingers nervously clutching the radio's grip. Suddenly, Latan froze. He raised his hand, stopping the others. "There," he whispered, pointing towards the river. "I hear a motor." The sound was barely audible, muffled by the noise of water and leaves, but it was there, a faint hum gaining strength. A helicopter. Perhaps American. Perhaps their chance. "They're waiting for someone," Chen suggested, his voice trembling with excitement. "Or taking someone away." O'Connell listened. The sound became clearer. This was not just a chance find. This was their objective. But the ambush and the mines. "We can't go past them," he said. "If they see the helicopter, they'll see us too." He looked at his men. They were exhausted, but a new glint appeared in their eyes. Hope. "I have to come up with something." A plan began to spin in O'Connell's mind. Risky, insane, but the only possible one. He looked at Harrison, then at Lethan. "Harrison," he said, his voice calm, yet tense. "You and Latan will go straight to the river. Find a place to take cover. Chen, you're with them. You will wait. I will distract them." "What?" Harrison exclaimed, his eyes widening. "You can't." "I can," O'Connell interrupted, his gaze firm. "This is the only chance. If I can draw their attention, for a few minutes at least, you can reach the helicopter, or the extraction point." "But," Chen began. "There will be no buts," O'Connell said. He pulled out his machete, feeling the cold touch of steel. "I'll give you a signal. When you hear the shots, run. Don't look back." He looked at his men. Their eyes held fear, understanding, and perhaps resignation. This was a sacrifice he was willing to make. For them. For a chance, however slim. "Go," he commanded, pushing Harrison. "Forward." They moved, slowly but decisively, towards the river. O'Connell, on the other hand, took a deep breath, turned, and walked in the opposite direction towards the ambush. He knew he was walking to his death, but in that, paradoxically, lay his strength. He walked towards the enemy, ready to give everything to save those he held dear. His heart beat in unison with the growing hum of the helicopter. He was ready. The jungle fell silent. Almost. Somewhere far off, deep in the green hell, something rustled, crackled. But here, at the foot of the hill, where the rescue helicopter was supposed to be waiting, an unnatural silence reigned, broken only by O'Connell's ragged breath. 3 minutes. That's how much time he'd given them. 3 minutes to dissolve into the undergrowth. 3 minutes to hide from the pursuer's eyes. 3 minutes to turn his sacrifice into their salvation. But time seemed to have frozen, like sap on the trunk of an old banyan tree. From behind a rock that loomed over the overgrown path, the first figure appeared. A Viet Cong soldier brandishing an AK-47, his face a mask of focused rage, his eyes two embers, fixed on the concrete base of the hill where Bradley had stood not long ago. He didn't see O'Connell. Not yet. "Got to go!" This silent scream hung in the air, sealed between a sigh and a moan. His feet, shod in worn combat boots, seemed to have filled with lead. Every step required an effort comparable to climbing a mountain, every second an ordeal of will. From behind the trunk of a tree, resembling an inverted heart, another enemy soldier slipped out, then a third, a fourth. They moved cautiously but confidently, their movements honed by years of war, their objective, to comb every inch of this cursed land. O'Connell gripped his machete. The steel chilled his palm, a familiar sensation he so loved before heading out. The Celtic words he muttered to himself now seemed a ridiculous echo of former times. "Don't let go, Bradley. Don't let go." It sounded as if someone else was speaking to him, from the depths of his own memory. He saw Harrison, Chen, and Saavedra pressing themselves to the ground, dive into the dense thicket. Their silhouettes, barely visible in the dim light, melted away like smoke. Latan, their guide, moved with the grace of a wild beast, blending with the terrain. They were going, they were running, they were living. The first shot, sharp like a whip crack. O'Connell ducked. The bullet, spitting from the AK's barrel, whizzed over his head, leaving behind only a faint ripple of air. The enemy was close, too close. He knew there were no chances, almost none. But that almost, that was the tiny island on which the last instinct of survival clung. He lunged forward, not back, but straight into the center of the approaching wave. The enemy, spotting the movement, reacted instantly. A fiery crack tore through the darkness. O'Connell fell, awkwardly, hitting the damp earth painfully. A burning pain flared in his side. Another bullet, ricocheting off a rock, traced a line near his temple. He tasted dirt mixed with blood. "Hit!" someone shouted in Vietnamese. He rolled, raising his machete. In his eyes, flickering shadows of enemies. Their faces, contorted with strain, drew closer. He felt their breath, the smell of gunpowder and sweat. "Don't let go." This phrase flashed through his mind, but now it was not a call to a comrade, but a desperate cry from himself. Don't let go of your weapon. Don't let go of hope. Don't let go of life. He struck. A metallic screech, a piercing scream. The first enemy, falling to the ground, seemed to freeze in astonishment. The next step, and another blow. His movements were not precise, not calculated. They were furious, instinctive. The pain in his side pulsed, but he paid no attention to it. His body worked on its own, in some wild, desperate dance of death. He saw two more enemies approaching, their barrels aimed directly at him. He understood that this was the end, that these 3 minutes, which he had given his men, had long since passed. He felt his strength leaving him, the darkness slowly but surely clouding his consciousness. One of the enemy soldiers stumbled, an awkward movement that shouldn't have happened. O'Connell used that moment. He lunged forward, ignoring the pain, and plunged his machete into the enemy. Then, turning, he met the gaze of the last attacker. There was no malice in the enemy's eyes, only a strange weariness. "Don't let go." That was the last thing he heard before the world plunged into darkness. The air in the workshop smelled of machine oil and dust. A sunbeam, piercing through the grimy window, illuminated golden particles dancing in its shaft. Bradley O'Connell, 52, stood by an old generator, assembled from the remnants of past lives. A deep, jagged scar above his left eyebrow now seemed part of his face, like a pattern embedded in his skin. He wore work pants and a faded flannel shirt. His hands, strong, calloused from constant work, rested on the metal casing. The generator gave a final gasp and fell silent. Its story was over. "That's it, old man," Bradley muttered, stroking the cold metal. This was the last thing he had to fix today. An hour remained until the workshop closed. He remembered buying this house in a small town in Oregon. Silence. No explosions, no screams, only the buzz of insects in the summer and the crunch of snow underfoot in that winter. And of course, his hands, which found solace in fixing broken things. He was 32 when his world shattered in the Ashau Valley. 32 years, and he had already seen more death than many see in a lifetime. The Green Beret, the emblem of the 75th Ranger Regiment, now lay dusty at the bottom of an old chest. Vietnam was a distant, bleeding memory that troubled him on quiet nights. He knew the scar on his face was just a superficial scratch compared to the ones left inside. He reached for the ignition key. Massive, heavy. Once he had held an M16, a machete, but now his fingers were accustomed to wrenches and screwdrivers. He felt the cold metal. That sound, a light click, then a familiar snort, should have started the engine. Bradley turned the key. 2 short, dull thuds, and silence. He tried again. Nothing. Something inside had finally broken. He punched the casing, to no avail. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes. His ears were ringing. It wasn't the sound of the workshop. It was an echo, distant but piercing. "Don't let go," a shout he himself had once thrown at a partner in trouble. He shouted it so that he wouldn't be abandoned, so that he would hold on. And now that shout returned, not as a call to another, but as an internal whisper, a reminder. Don't let go. Of what? Life? Hope? Memory? He recalled the flickering shadows in the jungle, the smell of gunpowder and sweat, the desperate glint in Joe Harrison's eyes as he covered their retreat, the timid face of Li Chen, muttering call signs, the last thing he saw in Latan's eyes, and Emiliano Saavedra, the medic, whose hands were always busy bandaging wounds, and in the other, a worn photograph. He remembered how he himself, bleeding, tried to pull him out from under fire, shouting at him not to let go. It's not just a sound, it's not just a word, it's what remained, what kept him from drowning in the swamp of his own fear and despair, what helped him survive. He looked at his hands. They no longer held weapons. They built, created, repaired. They learned to live with the consequences. He couldn't erase the past. It was woven into him, like the scar above his brow, like that quiet but persistent whisper deep within his soul. Bradley O'Connell, Razor, the one who always came back. Even when it seemed all was lost, opened his eyes. The silence of the workshop seemed deafening. He knew that this sound, this cry, would haunt him until the end. But now he understood. It is not a curse, it is a reminder. A reminder that even in the deepest darkness, when it seems all is over, there is always a chance to hold on, a chance not to let go. He left the workshop, leaving the silenced generator behind him. The sun was already setting, painting the sky in crimson hues. Somewhere far, very far, an echo could still be heard, and he knew it would stay with him forever.